Last week, after a long, hard-fought battle with cancer, my grandfather passed away in his sleep. We didn't always have the best relationship. By the time I was 16, I was smoking weed and growing my hair long. By the time he was 16, he joined the US Navy and was sailing off to the South Pacific on an aircraft carrier. Needless to say, we didn't understand each other for a long time. But over the past few years, we've grown much closer. I guess because as I grew older, I squared myself away, and in turn, he'd become a little softer, a little warmer in his old age. I developed somewhat of an interest in military history, so as a result we spend many an hour emptying beer bottles as I coax one story after another from him. By the time he died, we were talking pretty much every day, mostly by phone, but it became somewhat of a daily highlight for me. Naturally, when my cousin called one Saturday morning to tell me that he slipped away during the night, I was heartbroken. I simply thanked her for calling, hung up the phone, then sat down on my old coffee-stained couch, weeping uncontrollably. Not so much tears of loss or grief, but tears of joy. Tears of thanks that I was lucky enough to build a relationship with him, even for a short time, long after I thought it was far too late to do so. A week or two after his funeral, the same cousin called again to inform me that she and her husband had discovered an old footlocker in my grandfather's attic. According to them, it was filled with old naval memorabilia, photos, journals, and souvenirs of his time in the Pacific theater of World War II. I got into my car and drove over to their house immediately, only to find out that the footlocker in question was securely sealed with a rusty old padlock. My cousin confessed to me to not really knowing what was inside, but we agreed that the old US Navy stencil made for an easy guess. The only thing to do now was to find a way to remove that lock. When I finally convinced a mechanic friend of mine to drive over with his pair of big heavy bolt cutters, we spent an hour or so poring over my grandfather's effects. The photos. My God, those photos of him in his teenage years. He looked just like me. I mean, it was like looking into a Empire tone mirror. Like looking at a version of me from some alternate dimension. By the time my friend bid farewell and drove home, I had a solid lump in my throat. If only my grandfather and I could have reviewed the footlockers' contents together. If only we'd had a little more time, just a little more. It was later that evening, while polishing off a bottle of his favorite variety of naval rum, that I came across a small leather-bound journal, hidden in the bottom of the footlocker. Placed neatly on top of it was an old paper ID card, the flimsy kind with faded ink that was descripted across the surfaces during a time of extreme scarcity. The ID card depicted a logo of sorts, with both English and Japanese characters visible on it. The English characters read ABCC. Confused, I hammered the acronym into Google, wondering why I had never heard him mention such an organization before. It didn't take long for me to work out why. The letters stood for the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission. My grandfather was barely out of his teenage years when the Second World War ended. It was, without a doubt, his favorite story to tell of his time in the Navy, when he and his shipmates had gathered around the wireless radio to hear the news of the Japanese surrender. He said he'd never seen anyone so happy in all of his life, that all of the college football touchdowns and lottery winners he's seen couldn't hold a candle to the kind of happiness he's seen on his friends' faces. They were going home. Only they didn't go home. Not for years. I always assumed that my grandfather was just a regular part of the occupation forces that stayed around the Japanese islands in the aftermath of the surrender. But I was wrong. He was part of something uniquely horrifying in the history of warfare. Formed shortly after the war by President Truman, the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission was indeed to merely observe, but not treat, the effects the bombs had on any survivors. Observe and report. Don't try to evaluate suffering, just observe and report. The thought sent a chill through me. I opened the journal and began to read. December 5th, 1946. 17 miles offshore mainland Japan. We're due to depart for the city of Hiroshima any day now. Captain Rabant says it'll be dirty work, but it won't just be counting bodies. He says the world has never seen a weapon like this before. That nobody really knows what exactly happens in Hiroshima. This has us all very excited to see the damage. The crew is mostly in agreement that the Japanese deserved what they got. Lots of guys say this is payback for Pearl Harbor, that they are weeping the whirlwind, whatever that means. Wrote home to Mom. Her and Pop say they're real proud of me. My grandfather's writing drifted off onto thoughts of home, and I found myself skimming the pages until the next mention of Hiroshima. Why hadn't my grandfather mentioned this before? It's not like he could have forgotten that he was a part of an event that shaped human history. An event which birthed a new age of terrifying atomic warfare. I found the next relevant entry and continued reading. December 14th, 1946, Hiroshima City. We patrolled into the city for the first time today. None of us could believe that a single bomb can wreak such devastation. Command made us wear gas masks and thick rubber clothing. It made us look like monsters. But when we saw what our government has done to the city, even in light of Japanese arctic cities, we felt like monsters too. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Whenever the roaring winds died down, we were greeted with the most hideous stillness any of us had ever experienced. Years of churning engines and booming ships' guns had left us unaccustomed to such a lack of noise, and it disturbed us greatly. No city should ever be so quiet, but it wasn't really a city anymore. It was a dead city. We were walking through a great stone corpse, a concrete cadaver whose bones towered above us at every turn. Yet that's not the thing that stuck with me. What gives me the shakes are the shadows burned onto the crumbling brick walls. Those shadows are all that's left of the people, burned into my memory like they burned that morning. Only when I stared dumbfounded at one particular human shape, the perfect outline of a once living person, I swear I saw it shift. Not by much, but I swear I saw the shape's head twist a little as I looked. It wasn't just me looking at that haunting charcoal black shape. It was looking back at me too. I finished off the glass of rum in one gulp, feeling the chemical warmth of the alcohol spreading through my guts with a shudder. It was no wonder he never mentioned the things he's seen in Japan. They were the terrified delusions of a frightened young man. Maybe he's just burned out and the things he's seen were a manifestation of years suffering under such unnatural stresses. I find myself reading on before I could consider it any further. December 18th, 1946, Hiroshima City. We ventured deeply into the city today, closer towards the epicenter of the blast. It was worse, much worse than our first visit. The bodies. God help us, the bodies were beyond counting. In some places, it was hard to tell where each dead Jap ended and the next one began. One carcass of a larger building had what looked like a patchwork quilt of burnt bodies carpeting its ground floor. It reminded me of a painting I once saw by that Spanish guy, Picasso. I forgot the name of it. Just inhuman-looking figures piled on top of one another, twisted, broken, and charred. What did we do here? Our patrol stopped when we encountered deep pit of bubbling black sludge. Steam rose from it. I could feel the heat through my protective gear as we dared not get any closer. The wind died down for a moment, bringing back that awful silence. That's when we heard it. Moaning. A deep muffled groan that seemed to vibrate from the black sludge itself. A portion of the sludge bubbled up, forming a loose structure. From the briefest time, it almost looked like a hand, like fingers reaching up from the stinking mass of tar. Then it was gone again. One of the men pointed, emitted his own muted cries of terror as another shape bubbled up from the black sludge before melting back into itself. A face. A clear human face, empty eye sockets, a screaming mouth. When we got back, I asked my friend Skip if he saw it too. He said no, and anyone that thinks they did needs to have their head examined. None of us have talked about it since. As long as I knew my grandfather, he always mocked my love of horror stories. Silly tales for kids and dopes, he told me. There are much scarier things in real life. I had no idea he was talking from experience. It was getting late. I had to work early the next morning, but I poured myself another glass of strong, dark rum and continued to read. December 18th, 1946, Hiroshima City. Today was our last patrol, and we're all glad of it. The closer we ventured into the city, the more horrific things we saw. 2 sailors had to be taken to psych evaluation after what we encountered last time. The rest of us are in silent agreement not to talk about it before the same thing happens to us. But after today, I'm sure that number is going to be much higher. A lieutenant had shoot a pack of Japanese dogs that had become feral due to the lack of order in the city. On all fours, they bounded out of some ruins in front of us, howling and barking as they limped along. We opened up on them with our carbines, putting each one out of its misery without so much as a second thought. They were different, though. These ferals. One man said it was effect of the poison that the atomic bomb releases when it explodes. Some kind of invisible toxin that floats around in the air and ruins whatever it touches. It had the most horrible effect on Hiroshima's dogs. Or at least that's what we were told ourselves. When we got closer and had a good look at what we just killed, we started to doubt that the things used to be dogs at all. They were so misshapen, hairless with molted skin. Wild dogs, that was the official explanation during our post-mission briefing. Wild dogs that suffered the effects of the atomic poisoning. But I know different. We all know different. Through clumped black fur, matted with pus and blood, I saw something familiar that seemed to shine out from beneath piles of burned, swollen skin. Dogs don't wear golden watches. Dogs don't wear rings. Trauma. That's all this is. A young man suffering from post-traumatic stress who couldn't quite compute the kind of destruction he was seeing. I couldn't blame him. Lord knows who I would have reacted if I was in his boots. I couldn't tear myself away. December 19th, 1946, USS Kabat. My buddy Bill told me a story today. It was his first visit to Hiroshima. We call it the Dead City now. He said it was raining when their landing craft docked, that the raindrops felt heavy, fat and black with dirt and oil. The black rain collected onto the goggles of his mask, obscuring his vision until they could properly be cleaned. He said other things fell from the sky too. collecting on his protective gear, strands of hair, the odd fingernail, scraps of clothing. I never seen Bill cry before, even when we lost Jack Holmes to that Japanese kamikaze pilot. But he cried today. He cried when he told me about the kindergarten, how they found the kids' bodies all lined up, each with a tiny skull fracture. They, like the dogs, were changed in ways that he couldn't explain or unsee. Extra eyes, no eyes at all, extra limbs, head splitting and delubricating. He cried when he described how their teacher, a charred mess of black, encrusted skin, has emerged from the ruins and begged them to kill her. He cried when he told me of how she knelt before him and pulled the barrel of his carbine to her forehead. And he bowed like a baby when he told me how he pulled the trigger. Enough, I thought, and slammed the journal shut, putting it back in the bottom of my grandfather's footlocker before covering it up with other items, hiding it just as he had done from the world, from myself. I hadn't looked at it since. I can't bring myself to read any more. He spent the rest of his life trying to forget what he'd seen in the dead city, and there I was filling my head with it all. I tried to cry. I tried to let it all out, but as I thought about his friend Bill, how he'd put that poor school teacher out of her misery, I couldn't cry. I didn't deserve to. I visited my grandfather's grave this morning, planting a little stars and stripes into the soft soil above him. I am so proud to call him my grandpa that I think about it for a while. Towards the end, he was proud to call me his grandson. It was painful, but I found myself feeling glad that he finally found an escape from the terrors that visited him, terrors that he never spoke of. He deserved peace. The things he seen couldn't reach him anymore, but it hurt that neither could I. Yet when I looked into passing at the gravestone next to his, I saw the first name and understood why he insisted on being laid to rest in this particular plot. Bill, it said. They had spent the war next to each other, and now they would spend eternity next to each other. I realized the bond that formed between men when faced with such unspeakable horror, an unspeakable bond of comradeship. The tears had no trouble flowing then. Rest in peace, Grandpa.